Hey guys, and welcome to our classroom away from school. Today we're going to have a look at something called auxiliary verbs as well as the infinitive form. Before we begin, let's see if you remember some of the words you've learned earlier. Do you remember tense? English for tempus, a way to measure time within verbs. Past tense, English for dåtid. And conjugate, the English expression for böja. And we only use conjugate when we are talking about conjugating words into different forms. There are also a few new words and expressions for you to learn. Infinitive, what we call grundform in Swedish, we write it as to play, for example. Also, you shouldn't confuse it with infinity, which means oändlighet. Then there's auxiliary verb. In Swedish, we call it hjälpverb. It's a verb that sort of helps out the main verb in the sentence. The three most common ones are do, have, and be. Finally, there's the word pronoun. In Swedish, we call it pronomen, and you might be familiar with this term. You might have heard it during Swedish grammar class. It's Latin, and it means instead of a name, or istället för namn. Words we use instead of our names are I or he or she, you, they, we, and so on. Now today's lesson will be about auxiliary verbs, but for now we'll only deal with do and have. Be will be dealt with during next lesson. This is important to learn how to use, as you'll sometimes find yourself with more than one verb in a sentence. Which ones do you conjugate? Should I add a to? What about the base form? So many questions to answer. Look at this sentence. In it, we have three verbs. One is an auxiliary, one is a main verb, and one is in its infinitive form. The auxiliary verb have, in this case, always need to be together with the main verb. Since we haven't introduced a new pronoun after they, the next verb needs to be in the infinitive. The next verb that follows the auxiliary verb have becomes conjugated. Verbs that follow a conjugated verb are in their infinitive form unless a new pronoun has been introduced. I understand. It might all sound like Greek to you, but let's take a look at what options we have. For example, you can't say they have brought nothing traded without completely changing the meaning of the sentence. Neither can you say they have brought nothing had traded. There are two main verbs in this sentence that are trying to both be connected to the sentence's pronoun. Not going to work. We can't say they have brought nothing trade either without breaking the rule for auxiliary verbs and verbs in the infinitive. But you can say they have brought nothing I wanted to trade. Here we introduce a new pronoun, I, to be paired with the new verb wanted. As you can see, to trade is still without a pronoun of its own and must therefore be in the infinitive. Let's leave the word have for a moment and take a peek at do. Here the rule is a bit different. The auxiliary verb do can't have the infinitive form following it, but must rather have its base form. Can you see the main difference between the base form and the infinitive form? Pause the video and see if you can find out. Ready? Hopefully you're correct. The infinitive form is always written with a to, in this case to trade, before the verb. The base form is always written without, in this case just simply the word drink. Knowing all of these things becomes important when you need to find out which verbs to conjugate in a sentence as you're writing. The verb do, for example, is always conjugated, but verbs following it are not. The auxiliary verb is used when you either ask a question or say something in the negative. And the negative in this case means a sentence that carries negation. And we know if a sentence carries negation if it includes the words no, not, or without. In this case, there's the word didn't, which is a contraction of two words, did and not. Therefore, this is a negative sentence. No, I didn't have the time. The verb have is always conjugated, but so is the verb following it. You might remember this from back when we learned about irregular verbs. Have you seen the newest Avengers film? Here we have the auxiliary verb, and seen, which is the past participle form of see. In the second line we had hoped, which in this case becomes past participle form of hope. And following it, since we haven't got a new pronoun, we get to see. However, auxiliary verbs can work differently depending on the sentence. If have is the main verb, auxiliary verb rules can't apply. Like in this example, I have a book. There is only one verb, and thus have cannot work like an auxiliary verb. Placing a verb in the infinitive after have indicates that something is required, like I have to buy a book. You could just as well write I must buy a book, but in this case, when have is the main verb, it needs to be in its infinitive form. To summarize, the auxiliary verb do is used in negative sentences, like he does not know the truth. Here the yellow word is a negative word. It shows that the sentence carries negation. It means that this is a negative sentence. It's also used in questions, as well as to create emphasis. And emphasis is something where we sort of want to press the fact that no, you're wrong, this is right. So instead of Tom drinks tea, it could be Tom does drink tea, as some sort of clarification. The auxiliary verb have is used in perfect tense sentences. In this case, we have, which is the auxiliary verb, brought, which in this case becomes the past participle, and then following it, trade in the infinitive form. If it is something you need, you'll have to use it with an infinitive after it, if have is the main verb, like I have to buy a book. It can also be just a main verb without a problem. In that case, I have a book. I know, this was tricky and quite long, but such is the nature of English grammar. This is difficult, but I still think you'll be able to manage this just fine. That's all for today. If anything has been unclear, rewind the video and re-watch it. Remember, you can always bring questions to class. See you there.